So one of the party perennial questions in cybersecurity policy area is exactly how to organize our military forces to achieve the cybersecurity missions that we need to achieve. And there's been a lot of talk over the years about, a cyber force. And there has now been a commission that's been put together, supported by several different organizations, but particularly the Center for Strategic and International Studies, to talk about how we would actually create a cyber force. So we'd like to have some folks, Matt Pearl and Josh Stiefel, come up to the stage to actually join me and Ari to talk about this.
All right. People have heard from both Ari and I. So Josh, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Josh Stiefel. I'm Vice President of Government Affairs for Second Front, company that specializes in accelerated applications to warfighters, and also the co-chair of the CSIS Commission on Cyber Force Generation.
And Matt Pearl, I'm Director of the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So my program covers cybersecurity, although there's another program at CSIS that also does some cybersecurity work in our Defense Department, as well as emerging technologies, quantum, robotics, cloud, things like that. We're as was mentioned, we're the home of the Cyber Force Commission. Although it's Josh and Mark Montgomery and some other folks that are really the folks who have done deep thinking about this and are doing, quite frankly, a lot of the work. So,
all right. Well, I guess I will start with the first question. So what would a cyber force do?
So it's interesting that, a lot of people are exposed to the military, particularly in DC, especially in the national security community, but there's a lot of misconceptions about how the military is actually organized, right? And confusion about the roles of military services versus the roles of combatant commands, and sometimes conflating the two. In our system since 1986, we have bifurcated the functions of force generation and force employment. So combatant commands are responsible for force employment, and military services are built to organize, train, and equip, also known as force generation, to create capabilities for force employers at the combatant commands. We have a system where we have 5 domains of warfare recognized by the department, cyber being the latest, recognized in 2004. But we've built military services for 4 out of those 5. So we have a responsible official and institution generating capability and forces for air, land, sea, and space. And we have an absence of responsibility for force generation in cyber. A cyber force would perform the exact same functions for cyber as the Navy does for the maritime space, or the Air Force performs for the airspace.
Yeah, I guess following up on that is, why do you explain why we need it? But I guess, and you've explained like the problem it's trying to solve, but how, I guess, would it work with the existing structure that we know today? And why is it needed for those purposes? Do we need to change, the Navy's cyber unit and the Air Force's cyber unit in particular, which are well known?
So,
yeah. So, I mean, I think that essentially, so your question is less about Cyber Command and more about for the individual services? Or
just like, how would it work, right? If you have the Navy for maritime,
right,
Air Force for air, Army for land,
So-
they all today have cyber forces
right,
of their own. How does this interact with those existing structures?
So the Army has more boats than the Navy has ships, right? But if something goes wrong, no one's looking at the Chief of Staff of the Army as being responsible for it, right? It's the Chief of Naval Operations. Every service flies aircraft. But if something goes wrong in our ability to wage air warfare, it's the Chief of Staff of the Air Force that's held accountable for success or failure. The establishment of a cyber force to organize, train, and equip for cyber operations does not ensure that it pulls cyber away from the other services, right? But just to say that there's someone ultimately responsible for the domain, because really what ought to occur in the same way it does in these other domains is you have, for instance, use of aviation assets in the Army in support of ground objectives, right? Because that's ultimately what the Army is responsible for. And you would have, at least in my estimation, a situation where having a cyber force does not preclude the Army from conducting cyber operations, but those may be cyber operations in support of ground objectives. Air Force being able to realize how to defend their assets, their aviation assets through cyberspace, right? But in furtherance of air objectives, as opposed to building cyber in support of cyber objectives.
And then how does that work with NSA and Cyber Command? Going to your point, which
Yeah, and this goes to Josh's point about force generation versus force employment, right? And so we're not questioning per se force employment, having a joint command, things like that. But the situation with Cyber Command today, which has been well documented by GAO reports and other things, is essentially it's a game of musical chairs, right? Where I don't have to explain to this audience that there's no like single purpose sort of cybersecurity expert who can do it all. And so you have each of the services that are sending folks to Cyber Command that have different skills, capabilities in a very ad hoc way. And the only way that Cyber Command has really been able to make it work is a game of musical chairs, right? Where they shift people around, try to hole up those deficiencies. And that's just not how you run a railroad, right? And so ultimately, we're really focused on the force, and it's in the title of the commission, that force generation aspect, so that the training, equipping, retaining, sort of having a singularity of purpose for that a cyber force could have, that's the focus, and that ultimately you're sending better folks to Cyber Command who would then work with folks there from the individual services in a joint command, as the military does in all kinds of other contexts.
So I want to talk just a little bit about for this audience to very experienced with like commissions in Washington, D.C. So can you tell us a little bit about the commission itself? Like who's on it? Like what's your plan? Do you have, you can issue a report with recommendations, that sort of thing?
So one of the things that's, I think, really important in the story is that, and let me preface this by saying I have my views. The commission as a whole, we've just kicked off last month, right? So we're still shaping. And when building and recruiting the commissioners, right, we said whether we should or shouldn't have a service, everyone should have their own opinion about it. That's fine. We start with the premise that the core assumption is the president has ordered the establishment of a cyber force, right? And we can talk about the why that is built in as the assumption, but we're starting off with that so that we're not kind of getting tripped up around the conditions and should we or shouldn't we. That's not the purpose. We're saying that if it happens, we need to have a plan to design what it looks like and how we're going to build it. So the commission has on it a mix of folks, people with significant cyberspace operations experience in the department. We have former commanders from every one of the service cyber components, right? So that's U.S. Army Cyber Command, that's Mar Force Cyber, App Cyber, Fleet Cyber. We have a former Chief of Naval Operations, so the senior uniformed leader of the Navy, who was responsible for organized training and equipping for the maritime space. We have the George Barnes, the former Deputy Director of NSA, leading academics, Michael Solmeyer, the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber Policy. And the idea is that were this to happen, right? Whereas in the case of the Space Force, they were essentially told to break ground on construction without having hired an architect or sketched a blueprint. We're going to design at least something in terms of a report that can be a metric by which, should this happen, there's at least a plan to work against.
Yeah, and I should just mention for completeness so that folks are tracking. So Congress separately tasked the National Academy of Sciences with doing an assessment. It's very different, right? Because what Josh is describing, we're trying to provide at least the basics of a blueprint for what a cyber force would be, so that the president orders the creation of it. Like that will be a starting point that they can use. And so what Congress tasked separately is more looking at a variety of solutions, potentially Cyberforce and others. They're solutions that we don't think are ultimately going to solve the problem. I think the main one sort of being something that's much more similar to what's done with special forces, which just doesn't strike us as a model that is going to fix the problems here. You know, if you look at the way that special forces are governed in the military, it's really the fact that like there's complementarity between the missions of the different services, so that, you know, you have Army Rangers, you have Navy SEALs, they have their unique missions, and then you sort of bring them together and they're able to be greater than the sum of their parts. Whereas in cybersecurity, it's not sort of, there aren't these fundamental differences in the mission of the services that will make that work. But they're going to be looking at all those models, and we're talking to the folks who are doing that effort to make sure that our work complements theirs.
How do you see private sector working with the cyber force in what you're envisioning? Obviously, that's going to change as the commission goes forward, but and I guess it's three different elements of it, or two different. Let's maybe put them in two boxes in particular. So the DIB, and then also cybersecurity companies and large IT companies.
So there are three main functions that the Department of Defense is responsible for. And I think it's important to kind of lay that out because it helps distinguish kind of what the expectations ought to be. We have to be able to conduct operations in cyberspace. We need to be able to build and securely operate technologies. And by that, I mean networks, but also weapon systems and operational technologies. And then we have to ensure that we are enabling the security of our partners, whether industrial partners, academic partners, or international partners, so that the people we're dealing with and who are supplying us with, you know, goods and technologies, that we've mitigate at risk to the extent possible from what they're delivering. For the defense industrial base, should there be a cyber force, there's two things. I actually think that not only do you sort of enable the establishment of a new sort of subsector that supports the dedicated and focused resourcing from a new institution, but you also then encourage the existing services to really focus in on something that's long plagued them, which is weapon system cybersecurity. Because you now say, look, you no longer have that excuse to rest on that you can't put cyber talent against this problem set because you're staffing your cyber mission force billets. You are going to now be held accountable for where we've historically fallen short. So I think you actually encourage sort of greater security oversight and management and prioritization from the services over the weapon systems they're acquiring, as well as encouraging and facilitating sort of a whole new subsector. I mean, look at the space industry today compared to before 2019 with the establishment of the Space Force. I mean, there was a clear distinction in the sort of robustness of the space sector after the establishment of Space Force, because you had dedicated, focused, institutionally incentivized resourcing going to that. And it's benefited both the nation and the military immensely.
I think, you know, one of the things that was talked about at the CSIS event where you launched announced the commission, you know, is we're not the only ones with cyber forces. In fact, we actually may be somewhat late to the party. You want to talk about some of those reasons that are driving, you know, the thinking behind a cyber force?
Yeah, my concern is that there's no country in the world that's better prepared for a 20th century conflict than we are. Unfortunately, that's not the one we're going to fight, right? I would argue that the Israelis are the world's first independent cyber force. Well sort of trodden talking point is, you know, we're going to be more like the Israelis, you know, look how serious they take it. But the reason why that organization is so robust is the chapter that precedes it, which is that a lot of the reasons and rationales for 8200 were built out of the failings of the Yom Kippur War, where there was a commission established afterwards that said one of the reasons why they had so many fatalities and casualties was they lost the tech fight with the Egyptians employing EW capability supplied by the Soviet Union. And that was really the catalyst for this robust, you know, view that we can never lose the tech fight before. But it meant Israelis died first. And I don't want to have to learn that lesson here for something that, you know, was already sort of learned by, you know, one of our top allies. So Israel, arguably the UK, the Singaporeans, the Chinese, they've all moved heavily into this. And it's not dissimilar from the history of air forces with the UK and the first independent Air Force, the Royal Air Force in 1918, and us waiting till 1947 to get around to it.
I will say, I mean, based on my experience in Israel, that in the 1990s, you talk about where the top recruits were going to, they were all pilots, right? And then by 2010, they were all going to 8200 or to other similar cyber efforts, right? So, and that was well known, like throughout the country, like that's where the smartest people went. So in both cases,
because that country has demonstrated that it values those individuals, those positions above all else. Today, our institution does not value our cyber operators, right? They're typically, diminished at the expense of their institutional homes who are promoting what they are prioritizing, right? The Air Force prioritized pilots. That's great. I'm good with that. I'm good with the Air Force focused on air warfare, but I also want someone focused on cyber warfare.
Yeah, and this gets to the question of, I mean, whether you believe we need a cyber force, to me, and being convinced of it is like, is this just a structural problem that there's no easy fix, or are there patches or interim steps you could take? And when you think about those interim steps, right, like there's huge issues with training and inconsistent training that the services provide, right? And so in terms of skills, there are all kinds of problems, right? And you could develop programs that like tried to solve that, but a lot of that sort of just goes out the window in an organization like the military that necessarily has to be like so hierarchical and so top down, where commanders are going to have their priorities. And so, if you develop those sorts of patches, like, yes, things might get a little bit better, but ultimately you're not going to solve the problem, because ultimately the folks in charge who are setting the priorities are going to, oftentimes for good reasons, right, but are going to upend that in a way that's really going to detract from the ability to be effective in cyberspace.
And I'm going to take a position that I think, is somewhat unpopular. Not only will there be a cyber force, I'd say it's inevitable, right? The failings that we see today are actually not dissimilar from the Army's mismanagement of aviation in the 20s and 30s, the missteps that the Air Force made in its management of space through the 2010s. It's like, we as a country, we've seen this movie play out. It always ends the same way. We're seeing the same in cyber. I would say we're seeing the consequences magnified because it's exhibited by 4 institutions instead of the case of one in those earlier historical antecedents.
So another question back onto how the commission works. So if you have comments of your ideas, comments, etc., and I guess what is the way for the folks out here to engage that are not members of the commission or not advisors of the commission? How do they get their voice heard? And are you going to engage, have public engagements, etc.? How does that work?
So often in the case of commissions, they announce it, they then disappear for 6 months and then emerge with a report and say, look at what we did. I think we want to do the exact opposite of that, which is constant engagement, constant sort of interactions with folks. We're very lucky to have very talented senior advisors like Ari here who are helping us understand blind spots that we have. And so reach out to us, reach out to the commissioners. If you're in the cyber ecosystem, you are no doubt one link removed from any one of the 17 commissioners we have today or senior advisor. So please, I talk to a lot of people at all hours of the day, particularly for this reason.
Although please don't email me and not CC anyone else at CSIS, because I'm sometimes not good about reading every email.
All right, so we're going to bring this to a close. I guess my last question for you, the most important one that everybody is thinking about, given what happened with the Space Force, is the commission going to make any recommendations on uniforms?
It's uniforms and then the name of the service that the individuals would be called that I hear about the most.
Clearly it's got to be hoodies, right?
Hoodies and hackers, right?
Camo hoodies.
I say that in jest, but in all seriousness, right? Like, we can all make fun of the Space Force uniforms, but in reality, do any of us really care? If it makes them feel better, it makes them better at their jobs and more confident, who cares what they're wearing? So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, actually, I have a bit of a different perspective on that, which is it's funny to laugh at, but I think that stuff actually matters. When you think about Secretary Hegseth's recent speech to leadership in DoD, and sort of however you feel about that. Some of the things you talked about, like physical fitness and a lot of the sort of like that stuff actually matters, right? To having like organizational unity and to really having that ability to accomplish the mission. So I don't know. I'm not good at designing that sort of thing, but I actually think that this stuff is ultimately significant to being effective.
I would just say, we talk about this. You mentioned, we've been talking about this for years and years and years. Like, part of the reason why is because we're not getting better, right? Like, we are talking about this still because the model we have today is not delivering outcomes. Now, a lot of it is, oftentimes behind a curtain of classification, but say it continues to persist because we're not getting it right. And I don't know why we would ever, try to not be the best in these warfighting domains, or in this warfighting domain, as we are in the others.
I do want to make one last point, and I think it comes down to some of the engagement that we'll get from folks in the audience and others, is we do want to like lean into the challenges here, right? They're in terms of maintaining an officer corps, that some of the challenges in Space Force with the ability to obtain promotions and really have a career path. Or so like we don't want to, the goal here is not we're convinced of this and we just want it to manifest. It's really to lean into maybe some of the skepticism as well.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'll raise one other skepticism that you guys can respond to that I hear a lot in this discussion and basically any other. I mean, it seems like the solution to any problem in Washington is we need a new agency or new more bureaucracy to deal with it. And in cyber,
Preceded by a commission.
Yeah, preceded by a commission or two commissions in this case. And in cyber security in particular, we may have far too many institutions and not too few, right? So that's just sort of one that I've been hearing around town about this discussion.
Cybersecurity is a very crowded area in both the commercial space and inside government. What's unique is that I don't use the term cybersecurity when talking about a cyber force. I say cyber operations, right? That's inherently distinct. And the problem is there is no one doing that, right? There is no one organized, training, and equipping for that fight.
All right. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Join me in thanking Matt and Josh and Ari.